welcome to another amazing session of the Detail Researcher series. My name is Puyin Wong. I am one of the organisers behind the scene and also a PhD student on the TEL program at Lancaster. Before I introduce Bonnie to you guys, I just wanted to introduce my co-host, John. Do you want to say a few words?
Hi, I'm John Brindle. I am also a PhD student in TEL at Lancaster.
Right, okay then. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Bonnie Stewart, who is an Associate Professor of Online Pedagogy and Workplace Learning in the Faculty of Education at the University of Windsor in Canada. Bonnie is someone that I've long admired for a long time, and when I found her on Twitter, I'm like, I've got to follow this person. And for months and months and months and months, I thought, please follow me back, please follow me back. And one day she did, and my dream had come true since. I really, really admire the things that Bonnie's done. And interestingly, I was writing my PhD confirmation document the other day, and the first paper that I found from my search was actually by Bonnie. And literally the first page, something that she wrote that really struck a chord with me, which is, I approach digital learning as open by default rather than closed. And that is something that I think I can say on behalf of myself and John, we're both trying to do more, which is the kind of like openness, the sharing with people. And this is part of the reason why this webinar is happening and it's open for all. So I'm going to stop talking because you're not here to listen to me. You're here to listen to Bonnie. So I'm going to hand the stage over to the wonderful Bonnie.
Ian, thank you so much, folks. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, wherever you are. It is an honor and a privilege to be here. I was so excited when I found Puyin on Twitter, particularly when the baking conversations started. EdTech baking, I'm a big fan because I'm a big fan of baking generally. This is meant to be sort of a 30-40 minute conversation, really more of a presentation from me about this question in front of us about the datafication of the university. And then I will absolutely stop talking and we can talk, and I will stop sharing and we can go back to chat. And I will also be happy to share the slides with you. I need to say that for anybody, Lucas, I see you out there, who was at OER 23 a few weeks ago in Inverness. I was delighted to be there. I had a wonderful time, and you have seen a lot of this presentation because it is a mix of two threads of conversation that I've been pulling together lately, which is really, what the heck do we do in this time with the changes that are happening? I first want to introduce some of the faces that have contributed to some of the research that you're going to be seeing. This is my RA research team, my research assistants on my Datafication project for the last couple of years. The very tall person in the back is PhD student named Erica Miklas. The person up to her shoulder in the front is a PhD student named Tu Lee. And the blonde person also in the front is an MEd student who just defended on Monday and has my supervisee completely finished her MEd, and her name is Samantha Sarek. And so all of these folks have certainly contributed to the work that I'm presenting over the last couple of years. But in some ways, this both threads together our research and my teaching practice. Now, I am curious, I can't see the chat, but Puyin, I'm going to rely on you as kind of my eyes and interpreter here. Just if folks could throw into the chat, first of all, do you teach in any context? Because it's important to me that I have some sense of, I guess, the room that I'm addressing. And I'm wondering if folks are more on the research side, more on the teaching side, more on the instructional development side, which often involves teaching. What are we seeing?
Yes, so for me personally, I'll kick off first. I work in staff development, so I would call them training rather than teaching. because you don't really develop a kind of like a 2-3 year relationship with the same people. And Liz is in PhD teaching role as well as a leadership, and then John as a learning design manager. So it's not really answering your question, but here we go.
That's okay.
And Alexandra, yeah, teaching role, staff development. Tucker, like me, staff development, teaching, training, not sure. Learning designer, curriculum design. So yeah, I'd say a mix of the kind of people who are in the third space, as it were, teaching, training, what is it, and the kind of more traditional academics, like Phil and Brad and Liz, who are kind of more your typical teaching people. So
Perfect.
a mix, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And that makes sense to me. I currently do have a more traditional faculty research service teaching role, but I spent the 20 years prior to starting this role in 2018 in a collection of precarious and sort of staff development, faculty development, experiential ed, sessional teaching kind of cobbled together roles. So I am certainly familiar. A lot of my approach to digital education has come more from a campus view and a staff view as a faculty developer than necessarily as a faculty member. So even when I'm speaking about what I'm doing with my students, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, I teach in a faculty of ed, so I'm teaching teachers, and I think I still tend to approach it as if they are educators and I am developing them as educators and thinking about their capacity with digital tools. So that's kind of where I am coming to this from. But for really since the late 90s, I have mostly worked in higher education, in Asia, in Eastern Europe, really in North America and the easternish parts of Canada since about 2005. And for a long time, my work largely centered around open and digital practice. As a culture, I did my own PhD on academic Twitter, which is the last 6 months have been a time of great anger, frustration, and mourning for me. But very much as participatory pedagogy. I really got started in the digital and the participatory digital as a blogger, and sort of that RSS era of I comment on your thing, whatever it is, and then you find me through that and you come to my page and we become known to each other through that kind of practice. And I've been interested in bringing that kind of participatory practice of network building into formal education, into campuses, into K-12 education for the last almost 20 years. And for me, open digital practice is about getting past print. I love print. I grew up in the print era. I'm highly print literate, and I've been spending most of that 20 years trying to build beyond some of those limitations of print. In the chat, again, how many of you have ever spent hours of your life writing something, an essay, a research paper that was only ever seen by the eyes of a single person? Anyone? Bueller? That's how I spent my entire undergrad. And what are we seeing? Do we have yeses?
Yeah, pretty much everyone so far. Yeah. Not surprised.
So one of the big pieces for me of breaking the practice that I was acculturated to, because I did my undergraduate degree, started in 1989, right? So I very much was part of that era of you typed it out. Literally, I had a typewriter and I wrote papers and I got feedback or mostly just a grade on them, and they were never seen again. And part of building my open digital practice was beginning to build assignments and assessments for my students where they could see each other's work. Not necessarily all the time, sometimes in a scaffolded way where we built to that kind of open sharing, not necessarily for the most personal types of assignments, but my default practice became, with the first LMS I ever used and then building beyond the LMS, the idea of I want you to be able to see what other people are doing. I need to design my assignment, therefore, so that they're not all the same, obviously, but that you can learn and see if you're in scope from someone else's assignment so that if you're wondering why your grade is a 4 out of 5, if we're even grading, well, this is what the 5 out of 5 looks like, whatever. Getting past some of those single eye, single audience defaults by using the capacity and the affordances of the digital. And for me, my main metaphor in that was thinking about the ways in which, for those of you, I don't know in the UK, did you grow up with Fisher-Price toys? This in the 1970s was the peak, most coveted toy in my small kindergarten age circle that existed. And it was the carry-along Fisher-Price schoolhouse. It had a little handle on the top and you could open it up and it had little desks and all of those things. And most of us, since we were 4 or 5 years old, have been to some extent acculturated to this idea of the school as bounded by its walls. Most of us didn't go to a single room school, but nonetheless, that the school is what happens inside that classroom, and we have been trained and taught to work inside the walls of that classroom. And getting beyond that classroom and that concept of walls is most of what my career has kind of focused on, and using the digital to do that, particularly in ways that connect people to each other. Most of that I see as a pushing beyond education as scarcity driven, right? Paper and print as a model are always to some extent scarce because they literally degrade, right? If you have an old book, it becomes a precious artifact, an object. Whereas if you have a digital artifact or object, you can share it infinitely with people and it doesn't become crumpled and its binding worn down. But also, if you have access to the digital to learn things, then you are no longer working with the limits of what's physically or geographically available to you. Huyen, I want you to watch the chat for me, folks. If you could contribute in the chat, how many of you grew up in reasonably small places? It could be geographically like a small town. It could be that you just kind of didn't have a ton of access outside of maybe where you happened to be. Are there any folks there who share that experience? Not so much?
Couple of people so far. Yeah.
So the place that I'm from is Prince Edward Island, which is on the east coast of Canada. It is, as it says in the name, it's an island. It's a little island. It's the smallest province in Canada. And I think it now has a grand total of like 160,000 souls in the entire province. But when I was growing up, there were probably about 120,000 people. And the capital city, the scare quotes are very intentional, might have been 30,000 people. Growing up there as a little kid who wanted to grow up, and I don't know if you can see my t-shirt, but be David Bowie. When I reached maturity, I didn't know a lot of people like myself. I didn't have a lot of language to describe myself, and I didn't have a lot of even things to read. There was, a small children's encyclopedia in my house, and I read the whole thing hungrily because I was looking for a world that made sense to me, but I didn't have access to it. And what the digital gave me when I got there was this idea of abundance. And abundance is not inherently digital. If you look at this quote on my screen, it actually is from 1975, but it's the idea that humans have been creating so much knowledge, so much information that we essentially have to switch. It is no longer possible to store within our brains all the information that we need, but it's also no longer necessary. And what Berlo was saying in 1975 was education needs to be geared towards the handling of all of this data, this fire hose of fire hydrant of information, rather than just the accumulation of data, right? So it's that move from a scarcity model to an abundance model of education. And I've spent a lot of time in my career thinking about digital environments, those that are closed sort of behind logins, LMSs, and that type of thing, those that are open where I can get my students out and blogging and sharing with whoever might be out there, and also using some of those, and you'll see it in green, in between public proprietary spaces. So I did spend probably more than a decade of my career bringing my students onto things like Twitter, which are public proprietary spaces where they're leaving traces, but so that they can build networks, so that they can talk to people, but they are not traces that are truly open, because when Twitter gets bought out by the richest man in the world, who also appears to have some significant issues, the ownership and control of the network over that space becomes lost. My capacity to ensure that my students are safe, that their data is safe, begins to disappear. Things change. The practices of abundance, and particularly that era of Web 2.0 abundance that I kind of came up in and was the core of my role as an educator, those don't monetize well. And this is what we're seeing with Twitter now, is a shift to a much more profit-focused, monetized, how can I make money out of this network? For me, in the work that I do over the last 5-6 years, there's these two intersecting trends that have begun to worry me. One, uses of things like Twitter. I love this GIF. I've watched platforms begin to push real participatory practices out of the way. So Twitter replaced RSS and blogging, and now whatever happens to Twitter, we're kind of stuck with it. And I see that as an enclosure of the networks that many of us spent a lot of investment and care and social capital building. And this follows from an English land ownership historical enclosure of the commons. So taking this common area that was held by the group, the network, the people, and putting a circle around it to make profit from it. And that model is part of how I kind of understand what has been happening with platforms over the last few years. And of course, I can't really teach digital technologies to my education students without talking about platforms. So that leaves me in a rough place. Also, I'm seeing that each of those platforms has become datafied, so that the four walls of the little red schoolhouse are now essentially tripwired with all kinds of extractive data collection, not just built into them, but that has become the purpose of most of those platforms. One of the core roles of those platforms is to extract data, to algorithmically collate it and feed us back all kinds of categories of how to make sense of what's happening on those platforms. And Sophia Noble, whose work you see here on my slide, Algorithms of Oppression was her big 2018 book, but she's been doing this work since at least a decade or more, looking at how when we move to this information and datafied economy, there is a whole shift to seeing these things just as tools, as if they were neutral. And of course, her work makes visible how instead this role of datafication amplifies inequity, it amplifies racism. And so these digital spaces that I was accustomed to using for participatory engagement, particularly in education, are increasingly spaces where, because they are datafied, because they are algorithmic, they are fundamentally not equitable spaces and not necessarily safe spaces for my students. And yet I bring them there. And in order to engage with my classes, we are leaving traces and clicks, and every keystroke that they leave, even every deletion potentially, is tracked by my institution or by the owners of the platform or by somebody, and I don't know and I can't talk to them about it. And we're increasingly seeing a lot of these tools and platforms being sold to our institutions by companies that are very much engaged in an enclosure process. The person who you'll see on the screen in front of you is Ian Linkletter, who is a Canadian faculty developer who just yesterday had his 3-year-long ordeal of being sued by one of the major proctoring companies. The anti-SLAPP suit, basically he's been sued for sharing stuff that was publicly linked, if even if it was not, what's the word? It was out there in public, but they hadn't shared the link, and he shared the link on Twitter. And as of yesterday, his suit was rejected. So his life is still being turned upside down by this company. And he has shared here that Turnitin, another company looking to engage in the arms race of our students cheating, here's a technological solution to find out, rather than a pedagogical one. A lot of your institutions over the last few weeks may have, if they use Turnitin, had their so-called ChatGPT detector turned on. And as the series of tweets that I screen capped this from would show, that service does not actually and cannot actually work. But our institutions are being sold this, and there is really these are not pedagogical companies. These are surveillance companies looking to enclose and make money from higher education as an industry. So this is the place that we're caught. And even the people who are doing an incredible amount of work to try to make this visible are literally being sued for it. I aspire, in addition to being David Bowie, to being Moira Rose from Schitt's Creek when I grow up, and I don't like that this is happening. The problem with datafied systems is that often the great insights that they purport to share with us are actually things that we, particularly as educators, already know. Yes, it can be useful to find out if a student hasn't logged into, let's say, my LMS and it's a few weeks into class, and I can potentially reach out to them if I get that information from my datafied system. Yes, but if that information about the student is also going to whole other levels of the university or to the company, or I'm getting this feedback piece that says your students are 80% engaged. If I'm standing in front of a class or if I'm teaching online and I don't know that my students are only 80% engaged, I would say that a lot of that is on me to know that and to be doing things pedagogically to figure out that they are engaged or not engaged, and that insight, which extracts a significant amount of my students' data and increasingly without clarity about where that data is going, is not necessary. It is advertising bananas as boneless. Also, the data can become an end in itself, right? So the turning of our institutional lenses to the things that we can datafy to make those outputs and markers of success is something that has been amplified in the last 5-10 years significantly. And I do not want to see the process of education, learning, particularly participatory education, meant to help students build their capacity to engage in a world of abundance, suddenly be reduced to the kinds of data that decision makers think is valuable for them to get funding from our government. And here in Ontario, there are certainly pushes towards that end. So I have felt a little bit hooped because I do digital education, and increasingly I cannot do the work that I do without exposing my students to spaces that I do not trust, do not feel comfortable with, and almost can't keep on top of. Spoiler, I do not have an answer to this question. If you have an answer to this question, I encourage you, please, to put it into the chat. But I'm hoping that we can talk more maybe about our practices for dealing with this reality, because I think that for all of us, particularly with the kind of work that you folks do, this is a fairly relatable problem that all of us are facing at this time. Very quickly, when I became particularly aware of this issue and realized that at the start of the pandemic, everybody was being forced online, I did have two pieces of research that I kind of engaged in because I wanted to get a baseline of, look, is this a common problem? Is this something that other people are, particularly my faculty colleagues, not so much those in faculty development, but those who are teaching students in any course, what do they think about this? So in the summer of 2020, I put out a small survey. I'm not a quantitative researcher. I don't know if it was the bestly organized survey in the world, but I put it out I did 4 proxy questions about people who were going to be teaching online in that September 2020 term, to find out what they knew about the platforms they were using, what their practices were regarding datafication, what their experiences were with datafied tools, and kind of what their perspectives were about what institutions should do about it. I had 339 respondents from all over. And one of the key things that really came out of that was when I asked the proxy question about knowledge, right? Do you know what country or countries house the servers and data for your current institutional LMS? I had asked people, are you going to be teaching on an LMS? Yes. Then they got this question. 65.8%, 66%, 2/3 did not know where the servers were. Now, real talk. Why does the server location matter? Does anybody in the chat know? You probably do. Again, folks who do development tend to probably be more aware than faculty colleagues necessarily. But it matters because the laws of every country are different. Here in Canada, a lot of the ed tech that we use tends to be housed in the United States. And sometimes there are servers in Canada that are made available to us so that when our students engage on those tools, anything that they put out is then subject to Canadian rather than American privacy law. But we have completely different legal systems, so that is important. It was particularly interesting to me, folks who responded who were coming from countries in the world that are not the United States tended to be more aware of why server location matters than folks in the United States. And again, I think that's a factor of, like any dominance, sometimes we are least aware when the loopholes don't apply to us, but it matters where the servers are, because if students are subject to the privacy laws of other countries, sometimes data, and I've circled this at the bottom, can be used for things even like credit scoring, whether someone is ultimately rejected by real life factors that impact their opportunities. I don't want to do stuff. Now, this wouldn't happen with the LMS, but I bring in a lot of tools to my classroom. I don't want to do stuff that is then potentially collecting and releasing data that could impact whether a student can get life insurance in the future, because I've asked them to, I don't know, write about their smoking habits or something. Because I do not know, that uncertainty puts me in a space that I feel really creates tension with my role to, ensure that I am not putting my students at risk. Ultimately, that pilot survey found that even though educators didn't know a lot about the data coming out of the platforms that they were using or where the servers were or any of those things, they did have strong feelings about what their institutions should be doing about this. And that is, again, reflected here by some of the research that Pew Research has been doing. In the States, only 9% of people believe they have a lot of control over the data that's collected about them, but 74% say it's very important to them. So we are living in this time of this click yes culture, and there's a real tension and conflict between what people feel about data privacy and what they feel should be the lay of the land and what it actually is. I wanted to look at this a little deeper in terms of education. So in 2021, I did a small qualitative study that followed up with 11 participants from the original survey and talked to them in depth about knowledge about our changing teaching contexts. And ultimately, this is where the three students that you saw in the first slide have worked with me on this. We looked primarily at practices and at barriers and beliefs about what should happen with data. People are experiencing real institutional barriers to becoming data literate as educators, and that then impacts the capacity to help students be data literate in this time. But the beliefs of educators were strongly that there can be benefits to some elements of data, but that they have needs that are not being met by their institution. They want to be more aware. They want to be involved in data conversations on their campuses. And those data conversations, and this covered 6 different countries, including the UK, the US, Canada, Saudi Arabia. We found that folks were finding that the conversations on their campuses around data were almost entirely siloed between IT and decision makers, and the pedagogical end of that conversation, even for the folks who worked in educational and faculty development, were absolutely not really present in those conversations. Ultimately coming out, and we have a paper coming out in IJETHE fairly soon about this. Educators' process knowledge about the details of datafication is not necessarily high, but their paradigm knowledge, their sense of this is something that is changing those 4 walls of the classroom, and it has implications for how education goes forward as not just a profession, but as an enterprise in society and as something that holds a public good role in society is important. So all of our participants grasped that there are real paradigm elements to this shift, this pervasive datafication of digital tools. But they're experiencing real barriers to becoming literate in how to deal more knowledgeably with data. We also found that institutions shape faculty data practices and are to some extent shaping a world where faculty are increasingly not knowledgeable about core elements of higher education's core functions, right? So institutions simply are not sharing information in plain language that allows faculty to become knowers in this way. A lot of us have been like, okay, we're going to trust our institution that they're taking care of this, that it's safe to use, but the institutions have not turned around and approached this from a data literacies or a data ethics perspective. We cannot leave it up to individuals to do this. None of the findings of our research are a condemnation of educators not knowing about this, because individually there are too many tools, the terms of service change all the time, and we can't just give people, oh, here's one little piece of faculty development type of thing to make you knowledgeable. This needs to be a conversation that is pervasive across our campuses, that folks like yourselves, in many cases, who are developing faculty learning experiences are involved in the data end of things at a knower level so that that can become part of faculty deep understandings and then student understandings of how we go forward. We basically need a whole kind of rethink of how we do data privacy on campuses, was what we found out. I'm not sure that's going to happen. But in terms of my own teaching, I'll just quickly wrap up how I've situated this in my work. So at the core of my work, you'll see open practice is still there. And I'm trying to do that, although not necessarily on places like Twitter anymore. I am trying to build student digital literacies because, again, my students will be teachers around open practice, and then around their digital literacies for every platform that we use. I'm trying to think about data literacy and privacy openly. Because I teach technologies, right? My history is one where we used to blog and do hashtag chats and podcasts. We joined other people's podcasts, then we did our own. But as I drop different platforms, I am really trying to think about how to do digital in different ways. At the core of that, like I said, is open practice. I'm using Catherine Cronin's from Ireland's work on open as a pedagogical practice that is complex, personal, contextual, and negotiated, still trying to get students to think about those participatory networks and how they can build them in a world where, let's say, joining a hashtag chat is not the kind of no-brainer that it was for me at one point. In terms of digital literacies, I do a lot of work with them thinking about tools and tool parades because I want them, as folks who are going to go out into classrooms where my own kids are in those K-12 classrooms, thinking about different ways of showing learning and using visual digital tools as well, instead of just writing essays. So I do a lot of students creating infographics. There's an example of, this is an infographic that one of my students created. Now, with the rise of AI in the last couple of months, certainly it's great to move away from having my students write essays. This is actually an infographic about ChatGPT, but I'm aware that AI will soon be able to create infographics and stuff like that too. And so I don't have a complete answer for this, but I am getting my students to engage with misinformation and do presentations on how should we use ChatGPT as teachers, or how should we avoid ChatGPT as teachers, or what should we think about all of this? Not just from a practical level, but from that 5,000 foot, what does it mean to use these tools? What does it mean to create in this time? And I'm getting my students to think about data literacy from that idea that the four walls of the Little Red Schoolhouse are now tripwired for their students, and teach them about, not necessarily that I expect them to go out and analyze the terms of service of every tool that they bring into their classroom, because they aren't gonna, and those things aren't meant to be read, but so they are at least going into that practice as knowers who can talk to their students about the problems with the click yes culture that right now most of us are a bit hostage to because it has been enclosed, while also introducing my students to open educational resources. And finally, I also talk to both my students and all of my higher ed colleagues about I've been saying it now for 2.5 years. I will keep saying it. We need a data ethics approach, not just at our individual institutions, but across the sector. There was a time in the 1960s when we did not have research ethics as a sector. And it is something that almost all countries have adopted. And there are flaws to the research ethics process, but we ultimately need to be thinking about the infrastructure in which we work as knowledge workers. Educators have to understand the spaces that we're in, right? Even in the face of change. And we have to work to both embracing abundance and embracing privacy. If we aren't working towards that in all of our thinking about digital, we are essentially handing over our role as faculty in academic governance to vendors, right? Because we don't understand the four walls of the classroom anymore. But we're also risking handing over the whole system of higher education, because that enclosure, if those vendors can completely enclose higher ed, adopt the credentials, they don't need the legacy, the prestige economy of higher ed anymore, we will lose, I think, the value that this sector offers, which is to hold a space in society that is not completely governed by the logic of business or the logic of media and the attention economy. And I think that's something that is worth protecting. The quote here is from Asada Shakur. No one's going to teach you what you need to overthrow them. But I think that all of us have a responsibility right now, perhaps while teaching with these enclosed digital tools, to try to give our students the knowledge that they need to overthrow this enclosure eventually. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to do with my work, in a flawed and bumping up against a variety of walls and doors way, while working in the open with my future teachers. And I love this quote from Ursula K. Le Guin: "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but so did the divine right of kings." And so that is my hope and what's behind my work on open practice, digital literacies, and data literacies. Thank you. And now I will figure out how to stop sharing.
Thank you very much. That's really, really insightful and really interesting. Yes, the clapping is coming in.
I love the big clapping here. That, thank you. That's very visible.
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie. Anybody got any questions for Bonnie? Because otherwise, what's going to happen is John and I are going to end up taking over because we are the two excited puppies every time. So we'll try and hold on to our excitement for a while. Liz, would you like to?
Thank you. Really interesting. I just worry, though, that if we haven't got any of the answers and we've been working in this space and seeing it develop, you know, I did my PhD, finished it 10 years ago in Web 2 tools, and we don't have any of the answers. So how can we expect new teachers to have answers? I feel as though we're part of the answers is what you're saying, awareness, but we can't really make a significant difference to the terms and conditions that we all click on to agree, to changing where the servers are located. I mean, I feel a bit hopeless. I just feel a bit hopeless.
I think that we are in a much more difficult time and straits than we often recognize. And I don't mean like, you know how there's always like fundraising for a particular disease, awareness. I think most of us know about many diseases, not all at this point, and awareness obviously doesn't cure diseases, but recognizing that we need to band together to do something systemic is the core function of awareness. And I don't think there are answers, Liz. I think that we have been enclosed by a system that few of us fully understand, and that those of us who do study it have been kept out of a lot of the decision-making, conversations around it, because we are not conducive to the bottom line of those conversations. And so I don't expect my students to be able to go out and find answers to this. I think what we are approaching is a tipping point at which either enough people will be aware enough that we band together and manage to put our elbows into that larger systemic enclosing machine, and go, no, okay, we need to change directions and create ethical privacy protection infrastructures that will govern other interests in society besides profit around these digital tools, or we are literally selling the farm. And I know that that's grim, but for the last 5 years or so, that's been kind of my conclusion about where we are. So I don't, all I can do is go out there and try to make my students, the people I encounter, you know, kind of, this really is actually a big problem. I come out of a tradition in maritime Canada where we were very much kind of those left behind provinces at the time of consideration, Confederation in Canada. And so they had like, the only industry that got left behind was like really dirty, predatory, like mining companies, coal mining, and they had things like company stores where people, you know, could only, they were paid in scrip and could only buy from the company store. And they banded together as unions and raised, they also banded together with an educational movement called the Antigonish movement. It's 100 years ago, where they tried to build people's literacy enough that they could band together and then put their elbow into that system and make changes using the systems that were available to them. I honestly think that we need that kind of vision as a sector. And it's hard because you in Europe have, sorry, you in the UK and Europe have GDPR and those kinds of rules where we don't in North America. And so we have even fewer protections around this than you do. And getting folks in our decision maker capacities to even consider adopting those rules is challenging. So I don't think it's going to be an easy path, but I do think we need to do it. John.
John, do you want to help yourself?
Yeah, I was just going to kind of add to that actually there is been a recent case where people have stood up against Turnitin with the use of the AI tool, and in the UK managed to get the ability to turn it off. No. So I think there are movements out there. Something's murmuring somewhere, and it's fantastic to see.
It is, and there are things to build on there. It was kind of, again, Turnitin is so sneaky about the way that they did that, because it became clear that that was happening in the UK, but it wasn't clear to those of us at institutions that aren't geographically there whether we had the same offer. And when people from my institution tried to ask our Turnitin rep, they got a variety of kind of blocking measures and we don't know, and it wasn't on the table for us. But I think, again, that is because of GDPR and some of the legal infrastructure that you have in place. I'm hoping that we can move towards that quickly. Brett.
So thank you for a really interesting talk. I mean, it mainly made me realize I haven't thought about this stuff enough, which maybe is part of the point, of course, but it does tempt me towards an ill-advised rant, you know, or an ill-informed rant. So one of the things here is, I mean, I really agree with this, and a lot of the terminology used, enclosure, abundance, all these kind of things, they're quite Marxist terms, which sits very nicely with me. But it strikes me that one of the lessons from a kind of Marxist approach is to understand the scale of the problem, the systemic nature of the problem, and what kind of coalition you've got to build to overcome it. And ultimately, I'm forced to conclude this isn't really an education problem. So it's like, if we as educational academics, educational researchers, are trying to confront this, I think the best we're going to achieve is some sort of resilience or defensive stance against an ongoing encroachment that we can never launch a counteroffensive against. And that worries me a lot. So I was trying to think, what kind of coalition do we need? You know, so what do you need to counterattack against this? There are people doing trade unionism in technology companies quite heavily now, Google, for example, and so on. You know, is there a need for a coalition to be built around these kind of issues that could really press these companies hard? I don't have much faith in the main political parties in the US or the UK to do this, or presumably in Canada either. Is there a coalition, and what could educators contribute distinctively to that? Do you see what I mean? I'm trying to see this as one component of a much bigger problem, which makes it more intimidating. But if we can address it, we might actually do something.
I do think we're nested within, like I said, the larger click yes culture, and that in itself is a problem. But I also think that a lot of, particularly over the last decade, there's been sort of the eye of Silicon Valley has turned on higher education as a cash cow that it was not milking to its full capacity. And I think we missed some boats in terms of, excuse me, doing this banding together early on, but even the tools that are specifically designed for EdTech are still being designed by startup guys, not by educators. And if as an industry, for lack of a better term, or a sector, we do have the capacity, if all of the institutions, or at least, you know, a critical mass of the institutions could get together and be like, no, we are not using your tools unless we have these terms. That's the only capacity I think that we have to make a change there. Sorry, my ninth grader is asking me whether we have a carbon monoxide detector at home. I believe that the science class is doing some interesting things. But I think that we probably still have some capacity to push back. And we are literally in that year, in that moment right now. I see Liz saying that Turnitin's AI tool is useful. My understanding is actually it does not and cannot work. But maybe it can. I think that we need to demand a much greater demonstration of the proof of value of any of these tools before we adopt them, and they need to be opt-in and not opt-out. And if we allow them to determine all the terms of these contracts, then we're making a terrible, terrible mistake. And I think we are making that mistake literally in real time. But that is the thing. We can't necessarily fix Twitter, but we do have more control over the contracts we have with EdTech tools, and we're not using it. Lucas.
Got Lucas, would you like to?
Teams is always an adventure on my Mac, so I hope everyone can hear me.
Yep.
I'll preface my question with the fact that I come from an institution where our faculty association sued the university in 2009 when we moved to Gmail over data privacy concerns, but we're still a Google institution. And this may be a little out of context for a lot of folks, but Bonnie, we haven't had a chance to talk about the recent Ontario legislation that requires a policy on electronic monitoring of employees for all companies with over 25 people. And I personally was woefully disappointed with my institution's response, which came from the Council of Ontario Universities, I think COU, and it was just very fluffy. And this sort of, you know, oh, we're going to have a policy that says we have to say what we're monitoring, and then we get this real fluffy language that dumbs it down so far that it's like, oh, it's okay, we just have to keep track of some things for security and don't worry about it. So balancing that sort of tension between being where your talk is and then these sort of legislative responses to like, don't worry about it. So just in a minute, your thoughts on that would be great.
I mean, we live in a really weird time where I'm not sure that anybody actually has a coherent and from an educational perspective, frankly, like acceptable global understanding of what's at stake here. Our lawyers who are signing off on these contracts are looking at very, very different kinds of interests. It's almost like you have a pastiche of different interest groups, none of whom have a full picture of that classic parable of the whole elephant. Everybody's holding a different part of the elephant and thinking that they have the big picture. I think it's probably clear that we don't, including our legal teams. And currently they're not incentivized to do so. Because again, the profit piece is at the core of this. And I don't have a solution for that. I very much wish that I did. I'm just interested in what Rachel shared here, and I'm also cognizant of time. It's 11, so not a solution, but I've been thinking about the opportunity to give to all of these students who are learning about data privacy and being asked to encourage questions of the roles they go on to take beyond their studies. in the absence of an answer, I think that all you can do is try to raise the question and see it as an opportunity that maybe somebody will be able to find something better than you have. I mean, that's what I do as an educator always. So maybe you folks will bring it forward, and who knows?
But you're leading the way. You open. I think one of the things that, for just kind of slightly responding to what Danielle has said about, data ethics need to start from a young age. Yes, there is that, but I think for someone like me, who is, quite rightly so at the bottom of the food chain, as it were, it's quite hard to make that bold step because, who are you? Who are you to, so it's people like yourself and many great people who, have the established identity to say, look, this is how it should be. I think that's quite important. Like, so thank you for leading us into the right direction.
Well, and to be clear, I'm nobody too, right? Like, I don't know how to fix this. I don't think anybody does, though. And so if we're all waiting around for somebody to know more than we do to try to get us on a different path, we're never going to get on a different path. Anyway, I realize I'm not the cheeriest speaker. I apologize for that.
No,
but
please don't. The intention of the series is to invite speakers to kind of, like Brett was saying, give us things to think about, things that we don't think often enough. So, that's just been a great session. We're out of time. I think we could stay here all day, but obviously Bonnie says a really busy person. So we'll just thank her for her time. I'm sure you can still find her on Twitter. I think we're all taking a slight step back from it, but I'm sure there are going to be other opportunities to engage.
Also, I'm Mastodon.
At that as well, yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you. And I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for coming. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about this. I really do think we have an opportunity to think about this together, and the work that everybody does in it is important. And, this is, I think, one of the big problems of our time.
Thank you very much.
Have a fun day.